OvR. The Blob. So as you saw in the opening, we are doing 1958 and 1988's The Blob. I am Derek, the convicted cinephile. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. I hope to do more of these videos, so if you like this one, I will be doing more as soon as I can. So when it comes to comparing remakes and originals, a lot of people are 100% on the side of the original for a lot of films, most films, honestly. But there are some cases where the remakes are as good or better. Obviously, it's all subjective. I'm not necessarily comparing the releases because they are, in fact, both amazing and worth getting. So if you don't have them, seriously go out and buy both of these while you can because they're fantastic. If I could sum up the original Blob in one sentence, it would be that it's 82 minutes of concentrated motion picture terror in blood-curdling color. That says that on the case. But it's true. So the original 1958 Blob is probably most famous for being Steve McQueen's first starring role in a obviously iconic career that followed it. Yeah, he was plays a teenager in this movie, and he's actually 28 years old, which is very obvious when you're watching it. The feeling this movie gives off almost immediately is just super. I mean, it's the late 50s, and it feels like the late 50s when you're watching it. Cool cars and drag racing in the streets and talking to the cops, and everyone's like, oh, those punk kids nowadays, and because they're just driving like assholes, basically. The other star of this movie, the Blob itself, is actually silicone and red dye, and you can actually still see it. It never dried out. It's still kept in the original 5-gallon bucket that it was moved around in while it was being filmed, and they display it at conventions and stuff all over the country and potentially the world, I imagine, if they can, put a 5-gallon tub of the Blob through customs. I don't know, in this post 9/11 world, who knows, right? The film itself starts out with probably the best thing about it, and that is the Beware the Blob theme song by Burt Bacharach. This song is catchy as all get out, and I love it. My kid makes our Alexa sing it, and he dances to it, and it's the cutest thing ever. Honestly, one of the best. And when you're not expecting it, seemingly out of place theme songs, because it's such a fun poppy song to be played before what is essentially a horror movie, even though it's a fairly family-friendly, campy horror movie. The song itself was performed by the Five Blobs, which is not a real band. It's actually the same guy recorded 5 times over to make it sound like there's actually 5 people singing, but it does the trick. I would play the song on the video, but I'm assuming it's copywritten, and I can't really do that. The opening of this movie is very iconic, where this molten meteor, which is what the film was at one point going to be called, crashes into the earth, and Steve McQueen and his girlfriend are at make-out point, like kids back then used to do, because there was nothing better to do. The scene itself reminds me of the opening of Killer Clowns from Outer Space, and it's so embedded in my brain. I kept expecting the old guy to be the old guy from Killer Clowns from Outer Space with his dog. It's essentially the same scene. So obviously the Chiodo brothers were inspired by the Blob when they made the opening scene of their film. So the old guy finds a little rock, cracks it open, and then this little pink sludge shoots out, gets stuck onto his hand, and he can't get it off. And this is the Blob, of course. And it's only about, as big as his hand in the beginning of the movie, but it slowly starts to digest him. The effects obviously are very cheap in this one, and Steve McQueen and his girlfriend run into him, not literally, but on the road. So they take him to Doc in town, because there's only one doctor, because it's a small town. That's one nice thing about this movie. It has a very adorable small town feel to it, which the remake also has, but to a lesser extent. But long story short, the old man is very slowly but surely consumed by the Blob. So by the time Steve McQueen leaves and Doc finds what used to be his body, it's on the floor, and then it kills Doc too, and then all hell breaks loose, and now the whole town's in on it. But of course there's one cop who doesn't trust the darn kids, those 28-year-old teenagers, playing tricks and screwing with the police. But luckily the chief of police is a good guy. He trusts those kids, and they all work together as a as a team, the whole town. Another awesome thing about this specific release is the color palette of this film pops like crazy. It's a 4K scan. My wife actually asked while we were watching it if this was a colorized black and white movie because it's almost so colorful in certain parts, like the skin tones and the blob itself, obviously, and the cars, where it almost does kind of look like the color has been intentionally enhanced for some reason. And another great thing about the movie itself, not necessarily the release, the model work is amazing, especially for how low budget it was. You got the fantastic theater scene where the blob's coming through the grates and it oozing through the projection booth. And then once it terrorizes the town, it starts to go through the diner and it's consuming all the seats in the diner. And it just looks fantastic. It obviously doesn't look real at this point, but the fact that it's all in camera just gives it a charm that any CG would immediately take away. Some of the characters we're introduced to in the opening are like the other kids, like the bad boys that Steve McQueen goes to high school with. They are introduced to be almost like the villain human characters in the movie, and then about like 30 seconds later they're like, oh, we're best friends now. So it's really weird that like literally every character in this movie except the cop who doesn't believe what's happening are like chummy as all get out. And there's this repeated gimmick with McQueen's girlfriend's younger brother, who's like got to be at least 10 years younger than him. It's weird. Constantly protecting the town, and he's like wearing his jammies and shooting out his little cap guns at the blob at the end. And it's like, oh no, little Jimmy is ran away from home. Where is he? And then he comes shooting out in the blob, which I can imagine this only gave him nightmares. I like to picture that the little boy grew up to be Kimasabi from Bubba Hotep, and he just constantly has flashback visions of him firing his cap guns at his giant prolapsed anus looking enemy. Asshole. But that's a whole other story. So while everybody's running to, from, and around the blob attacking the city, Steve McQueen and his girlfriend, I'd remember their characters' names, but I watched it a while ago. Steve's name is Steve in the movie. That's the funny thing. It's the only movie where his name in the movie is actually Steve. So his is easy to remember. They hide in the freezer at some point, a walk-in freezer, and then the blob tries to go through, and that's when you see it start to freeze, and then it sucks its way back out. So it shows its weakness for the first time. They go to the principal of the school and the police department saying, oh, we got to find this certain type of fire extinguisher. And the principal, luckily, is there. He's like, I know where to find those. The school has 27 of them or something. And then he goes with those punk kids from the beginning of the movie because they're all working together. That's pretty much what this whole movie is just like a small town working together to destroy this thing. It has a very convenient ending where they do freeze it. And then it's just like, all right, we'll send it out to some lab. They're like, oh, we're gonna move it to Antarctica where it'll just be frozen forever. It's just like it's like the most convenient and hilarious ending ever. If you like fun, cheesy 50s monster movies, The Blob is arguably one of the greats, and the fact that it's such a colorful movie makes it a little more visually entertaining than a lot of them from that era that are still in black and white, which, you know, there's nothing wrong with black and white. It's usually better when it's a choice than a need. There's nothing really bad about the movie. It's either going to be your thing or it's not. You have to take into account that, like, this movie was made like over 10 years before we landed on the moon. So it's got that corny B-movie dialogue and characters of the science fiction era. Like in the 80s when anyone with a computer could hack the planet, essentially. It was kind of the same thing in The Blob. Now, if I were to grade the film, I would probably say it's a 7 out of 10. It's a good movie. It's not a great movie. It's the perfect kind of movie if you want to watch an old-fashioned B-movie. I recommend anybody see it who hasn't, and either it's going to be your thing or it's not. A lot of people, I think, in the younger ages wouldn't get past how corny and old-fashioned the dialogue is. I think it's, like, charming and funny when you watch it. So you're either going to take it that way or you're going to think it just sounds dumb. But But what about the remake? 1988's The Blob, directed by Chuck Russell of Nightmare on Elm Street 3 fame. He actually tried to make The Blob at Warner Brothers, or not Warner Brothers, but New Line. Same difference nowadays. With Frank Darabont, who he co-wrote it with. And they didn't want to make it, but they liked him and Frank Darabont, so they actually offered them the job of writing Nightmare on Elm Street 3. So if it wasn't for The Blob, we wouldn't have Nightmare on Elm Street 3. And because of Nightmare on Elm Street 3 doing as well as it did, they were able to make The Blob right after that. So we got two amazing 80s horror movies out of Frank Darabont and Chuck Russell. I forgot to mention it earlier, but Jack Harris produced the original and the remake. They kind of thought, hey, The Blob could use a remake. I bet no one wants that right now. And they were right. Nobody really cared at the moment about trying to make a Blob remake. So I think they sold him the rights for like $1, and then he produced the remake as well. Let me start out by saying this. This movie does a few things in it that very few movies do that I am a massive fan of. And we'll get there when we get there. But let's start here. Kevin Dillon is the star of this movie, or a star of this movie. The other one being Shawnee Smith, who was driving me crazy watching this, what she was from. She's in the Saw movies. That's what I've seen her in a few times. This movie starts out almost identically to the other one, with the exception that Kevin Dillon plays the bad boy character. Like all the sort of bad boys from the original, there was a few of them who become instantly, buddies with Steve McQueen's character. They're kind of rolled into one in this one, and that's Kevin Dillon's character, where he's like the punk outsider kid that nobody trusts, and he rides around on his cool motorcycle. So he's the first guy you meet, if I'm not mistaken, and you see him jump a bridge on his cool motorcycle, and that's not going to come back later in the movie. And then we meet a nice young boy and a nice young girl played by Shawnee Smith. He's the cliche football jock, but he's a nice guy. And then she's the cute cheerleader, and then he wants to ask her out, and then they do, and everyone's happy. And then blah, 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 blah. The old man comes into the picture, just like in the original. And the old man gets devoured by the blob, but in this one, it's like a stomach is like what they describe the creature as. It's like a living, moving stomach that like is acidic and burns through you and digests you, which is a much scarier monster. And this son of a bitch is fast. Like in the first one, it's just like, oh my god, it's huge, and then they just kind of stay until they get murdered. But in this one, it has like tentacles shooting out of it at some points, and it's just like cruising on ceilings like 30 miles an hour. It's like scary as all hell. But yeah, the blob is a different beast in this one. Like it's actually frightening, and the practical effects in this movie are awesome. But then shortly after this, one of my favorite things that happens in the movie happens. Our presumed lead hero character gets horribly murdered by the blob like 20-30 minutes into the movie. So they pulled a psycho, and I love it. So Shawnee Smith becomes the main lead female character, excuse me. And then Kevin Dillon's the only one left to be the lead boy character. So then they have to be all friendly after that and work together, even though one's the bad boy and one's like, the nice girl cheerleader character. So I like that they flip that around. It's not just like the nice boy and then his girlfriend are working together with the town who all love each other. And this one, it's actually characters who have like differences and have to learn to work together. But the scene where that guy is getting killed and Shawnee Smith is watching it happen, he's literally being like waterboarded by the blob. Like there wasn't any computer effects, obviously. It was all practical. It was basically a sheet of blob just pulling back on his face, and he was like legitimately suffocating, and he just slowly gets eaten by it. And by the time she even like has the guts to walk in on him, his like whole face is just melted off. It looks amazing. I love when movies kill off the perceived main character like that. Like I mentioned, the plot works along kind of the same lines, except there's a lot more humor in it, a lot more relatable characters, realistic characters. It doesn't have that corny 50s dialogue that is so prominent in the other one. And it just keeps getting More disgusting and badass from there. There's a chef or like a line cook in a restaurant that gets sucked into his sink drain by the blob, and it looks amazing. Like I said, the thing's running on the ceiling, chasing after Kevin Dillon and Shawnee Smith's characters, shooting at him with blob tentacles going 40 miles an hour. And then that's the part where they hide in the freezer, as they do in the first movie, and realize what its weakness is. This movie hits a lot of the same plot points as the original one does, which sometimes is a bad thing, but for some reason it works in this movie. Like sometimes when movies are the exact same beat for beat, like the remake of Psycho is the perfect example of how not to remake a movie. But the remake of The Fly is the perfect example of how to remake a movie where it's just the basic concept and they change it completely. This is like the perfect mix of the two, where it has the same basic beats throughout, but the characters are different and the blob itself is just enough different, and the story behind the blob itself is different, but it still has that charming small town feel and likable characters. In this one, you find out that the blob is actually a government created weapon that got loose. It's not some freak alien thing that just happened to land. So that makes it a little more interesting, where the humans are obviously the real bad guy, which is essentially always the case. So I like that about it. But it still doesn't change the fact that they had to figure out how to stop this damn thing. And the people working for the scientists working for the government just like legitimately want to just destroy this town to stop this thing. But the town itself has to kind of fight back against them and the blob at the same time, which is an interesting change. And most famously, it still has the movie theater sequence that was in the original, instead of it just kind of flooding into the theater and scaring everyone out. It shows people just getting destroyed in there, mainly obnoxious customers, which is always fun to see. But then we come up on what is one of the other things that I love about this movie that no movie does. Very few movies do. Shawnee Smith is with her little brother, or her little brother's at the movies. She's there to get him and her friend, the boy's friend. They're both boys. They're children. But she's trying to warn them about this, trying to get them out of there because they're not supposed to be in this movie, and like their older brother snuck them in, kind of a thing. When they're escaping the theater, they escape into the sewers, which was a bitch to film, apparently. But one thing they do when they're escaping, out of nowhere, the blob gets the little boy's friend, who's like, you know, another 9-year-old boy, and just destroys him and just like kills the shit out of this kid. And as any horror movie that has the balls to just brutally murder a child, I mean, it gives me it's an extra point for me. That's all I can say. Nothing against children. It's just nice to see when characters that you can't kill in movies get killed in movies, and it just changes the whole thing, and it shows how dangerous the monster or killer you're dealing with actually is. Yeah, there's not much more to say about the plot than I already did. It's essentially the same basic story with different characters. I like that Shawnee Smith becomes the lead, and she's like a badass lead girl character, which my wife thought was cool. She commented on that, and I was like, yeah, you're right. She is like a badass lead character. And then I remembered, oh, that's because it was made in the 80s, and every horror movie has to have their kick-ass final girl, but that's what you got to do, right? But I appreciated that they made her the strongest of the characters, as opposed to the man there always to save her, like it kind of was in the original and, you know, most other movies. That's what's great about horror. Horror respects women. Hi, Oliver. He's the best cat ever, though, honestly. But like I said, horror respects women. People like to say it's misogynistic a lot of times, but actually, out of all film genres, horror is probably the number one that actually has strong female characters. So, the goods and bads. Honestly, there's not anything I really dislike about this movie. The biggest flaw it probably has is that it's probably a little too much like the original. But if you don't care for the original, or you haven't seen the original, that won't bother you. So it's only a minor flaw. Otherwise, this movie is so much more entertaining, so much gorier, so much more interesting, I would say. The characters and the dialogue are more funny than the original. The other one is a very bare-boned, campy B movie. This one is a B movie with, you know, an A movie budget, essentially. If I recall, the budget for this movie was like $19 million, which seems kind of high, honestly, for a B movie horror remake in the 80s. But I think 9 of that 19 million or something went towards just the visual effects, and it was absolutely worth it. I mean, that's like a common thing now, it seems like. I'm back when Star Wars came out, it was $11 million to make it, and he wanted to put $1 million specifically towards the visual effects, and they thought he was fucking crazy. And look how that turned out. So putting half your money towards visual effects when they turn out this good, and they're some of the better practical effects in the 80s, at least some of the most underappreciated, I would say. There's nothing that happens in this movie that doesn't look awesome or isn't in some way disgusting. In a good way. So overall, I definitely enjoy this one more than the original. I would probably give it an 8 out of 10, which is obviously not perfect, but it's a very good movie. It's a solid B, no pun intended. It has everything on the original. Dialogue, characters, effects, just the overall story, and the subplots are all better than the original. The only thing the original has on this one is that goddamn theme song. So if they could put that theme song over clips of this movie, I'd be the happiest man alive. So if it already wasn't obvious, the winner in this situation is the remake. Where is it? There it is. But like I said, do yourself a favor. Go out. Get both of these. This is an amazing Blu-ray with a fantastic transfer with really good special features and interviews. Same thing goes for this one. Criterion is like the best at restoring films. Like, I don't even know if there's an argument to that at this point. So picture quality, sound quality wise, the old blob on the Criterion release might have an edge, but essentially everything else about the remake and that release is better. So thank you again for watching. Like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Follow me on Instagram at convicted_cinephile. And I'll hopefully be here soon with another episode of OvR.